I talked to the students today and told the principal I've got about a 3-hour lecture, and in which I go through all the things that saw Trump elected, why he won, go through in detail all the things that he's done since in the extraordinary 100 plus days of his presidency, where he has secured a reputation as the most unpopular president ever in polling history in the United States, and the inadequacies of features of his direction, the difficulties he's experiencing making decisions and surviving within a complex polity like the United States, but nevertheless sustaining an extraordinary level of public support on the right that sustains him and may well sustain him through 8 years in the job. But he has been a seismic shock in global politics and a challenge in the alliance relationship that we have with the United States. When he was elected, there was an anticipation, including by some of his supporters, that he would move into an isolationist mould in the presidency, certainly rejecting alliances or the significance of them, rejecting international institutions, rejecting rules-based systems, but nevertheless extracting the United States from intervention in global politics. That is not his position. He is not an isolationist. He is a unilateralist. And that is a bird of a totally different feather. It means that he is an activist in global politics, but an activist down a narrow band of interest. The narrow band of interest being his definition of American national interests, with a particular focus on the economy, but also on military matters as well. You saw, even after the Cold War, a very strong realist strand in the way in which American presidents conducted themselves. Realism is nothing new, but they nevertheless set a standard after World War II in global politics, a standard of liberal internationalism, a standard where democracy and sovereignty were important, a standard where people should not close their markets off, but allow everybody to have an opportunity to rise to prosperity. Major international institutions were set up, many of which subsequently came to be regarded in American politics as a nuisance. But you had the United Nations, you had the IMF, World Bank. You had these institutions put in place and a human rights standard. And the relief, now that Trump is there, that those will not be necessarily in the background of every American conversation, has been palpable amongst many authoritarians across the globe. It's walking away from a multilateral approach to the practical things of life like trade, in some cases a multilateral approach to defence and national security, with an overriding American concern and interest and an underpinning resentment in the positions being adopted by the United States of where they see or feel themselves to have been mistreated, particularly on trade matters. He pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was not simply important that it was a point of American influence in the region. That was the strategic argument a lot of us were making. It was what the character of that would be. And the character of that would be decent governance, decent human relationships, decent working relationships, decent protection of intellectual effort. And that was all signed off as though it was a mere bagatelle. But that is essentially a position that reflects where the new administration of the United States is coming from. The thing about the Australian relationship with the United States is not that it's one-dimensional, but it's three-dimensional, and it's very deep and granular. On the military side, you know pretty well what it is, but not the significance of it. We are all seeing and all hearing. Remove the United States from that equation and we're almost deaf and blind. Add about another percentage point or two of GDP to our defence vote and we'd go to being half deaf and half blind. That's how most countries are, so at least that would be something, but gee, it would be expensive to get there. And more, our defence has to be perceived in technological terms. The best defence technology produced globally is American, and every piece of kit that we have, that we get from the United States, is exactly the same as the kit that goes into the hands of an American pilot, sailor or soldier. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty globally is massively under challenge, and it is failing. The moment now, extended deterrence to us by the United States means that we don't have to contemplate what we may have to contemplate and what the Japanese and Koreans, now that they doubt the Americans, are contemplating, and that is moving to our own nuclear weapon. Now, if you operate all of those things and cobble them together, you're talking about, 5 or 6 percentage points of GDP on defence. Nowhere near what we were in World War II, which was 32% of GDP being spent on defence, but nevertheless an amount that would make most of our social programs unsustainable if we were to follow that. We do not spend on defence. When you take a look at the total picture of where our priorities lie, if you take all those social elements together, you're talking a best part of about 220 billion against defence 30 billion. That spending is sustainable in no small measure because of the relationship we have with the United States. And then we go over to investment. And I'll go through this very quickly. The United States invests 860 billion in Australia, increasing at the rate of 80 billion a year. I mention that figure because that's one area that Trump may threaten. Not deliberately targeting us, but because he's trying to stop that level of American investment externally. 80 billion it went up in 2015. The sum stock of Chinese investment in Australia at that point was 75 billion. So American investment in Australia increases about the rate every year. It increases at a rate that is the entirety of the Chinese stock of investment here. Our investment in the United States, direct and indirect, now stands at over 600 billion. 70% of American investment in Australia. All of what I've been talking about, with the exception of maybe discouragement in the area of investment, and that won't be major, but it'll be there, is not vulnerable to anything that Trump might do. We are not on his radar screen. Our relationship with the United States is as close to equal that a great power and a medium-sized power can actually get in place. That puts responsibilities on us. And those responsibilities are perceived by other countries who feel they're going to have a more difficult conversation with him over the course of the next few years. Trump arrived essentially without a governing agenda. He had no policies. He had attitudes, but no policies. He is now putting policy behind the attitudes. And though he has reached out to China and has got their support in trying to do something about Korea, he nevertheless has them on a list of some 16 countries whose malfeasance in relation to their trade relationship with the United States is at the moment being subject to examination. And when this report comes out, it's going to be a doozy. Now, Trump thinks he's had a great visit to Europe. He's left NATO in tatters. That NATO relationship was at the heart of the humanitarian standards that the Americans, after World War II, wanted to set for the sorts of dynamics that they hoped to see in global politics. We see that those things are issues that completely disinterest him. He is totally transactional. The only thing he wants to know is whether or not they're going to pay. These are the positions that he is adopting. And what can we do? We can shape and we can hedge. We don't think of ourselves in terms of being powerful, but the Australian GDP is the same size as Russia's. We are an effective military power, we are an effective economic power, and we are effective in our diplomacy and our diplomatic conceptions. Therefore, we have a unique responsibility to keep those issues on the table in the hope that as time goes by, he may come to see and understand the value of them. I think it'd be a miracle were he to sign up to the Paris objectives, for example, on climate change. I don't believe he will. And there's nobody better placed to have that conversation with them on how they walk back from that than us. Then there is the question of how he handles his reports on trade, where you might see quite a dramatic change in the direction of American policy. We have to convince him that roiling affairs in the Asia-Pacific region will ultimately damage the United States, and a more sophisticated and careful approach needs to be developed toward that. And then we have the specifics. We've got Korea. Somebody shouted to him, the North Koreans are going to have an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. What are you going to do about it? And he turns around and he says, never going to happen. That's called a red line. And what he did was to place his administration's prestige on that line and then invited the Chinese to deliver. He himself was not in the business of making anything easy for the South Koreans, for whom he cares little. And that is something that we'd want to discourage him about and get him to care a lot. But since Vietnam, the United States stayed out of Southeast Asia. We encouraged them back into Southeast Asia. Kevin Rudd in particular did that. You know, it's been a vital factor in creating the possibility of a democracy in Burma, Myanmar. There's a range of things that the Americans have done there very usefully. We need to carefully talk the Trump administration back into that. Finally, we need to hedge. What does hedging mean in this context? Well, hedging here really means that we need to think in the way, not in the way the South Koreans and the Japanese are, but to some degree, the character of our military posture. We also have to look at war stocks. If we get engaged in a conflict, we need to be certain that for a substantial period of time, we can sustain our defence. We are not in that position now. I'll tell you who is thinking about us all the time. Every one of the countries I've been referring to, those in Southeast Asia, they don't think that we have no influence with the Americans. They think that we've got a lot. And they have a sense that we need to start spending some of that political capital. Thanks very much.